Once again, welcome to my cellar. I'm going to start off with this one with a pressing question that I missed on the last one, and I do apologize. Hi, Tim. I'm just looking at the still of you and Jay Wampler, that's Jim Wampler, as in Mud Puppy Games and Mutant Crawl Classics, and Scientific Barbarian. And with the cow statue in the credits of your show, please tell us what the situation is there. Was a town with a lot of cow statues? In New Zealand, where I'm commenting from, we have a town called Morrinsville that has a cow. It's taking the cow statues in a big way. Of course, it is a farming area, and the cows represent that aspect of the town. Okay. I remember several years ago when weird animal well, not weird, but weird animal statues were a big deal. In Cincinnati, they had flying pigs, and civic groups and individuals and whatever bid to decorate one of these, and then they were all over the city, and they've got some of them got auctioned off, and in Glendale, they have squirrels. That's a little suburb of Cincinnati, close to where I am, and they have squirrels. And Cheryl and I were someplace once where they had cows, but I think that craze has pretty much died down. No, that cow is at a rest stop, a truck stop, actually, or a gas station, if you will. Yeah, more accurately, a gas station in Indiana. Now, as I've said often before, Jim and I traveled to a lot of conventions together, and we used to travel in my Toyota Element, and the mileage of the Toyota Element always saw to it that we stopped at that particular place at least once, sometimes both ways, on our trips up and back from Cincinnati to Wisconsin. And so we went out one day and said, let's have a picture with the cow. Since how we're here so often, we're all friends. Well, now I'm driving a vehicle that has a much greater fuel efficiency, and we have to remember where the cow is and stop in there to see the cow. And see, it's a BP gas station, and they've got a sit-down restaurant, and they've got a nice convenience store, and they got a cow out front. What can I say? It's Indiana. So anyway, that's the story. Okay. This first one comes from a longtime friend and another industry person of many, many, many years, whose opinion I respect a great deal. I think newer players asking fewer questions is less about over-reliance on skill checks and more about them not understanding that the tabletop RPG's game world is dependent upon verbal description. I have no trouble with having a PC making an attribute save or a skill check to see how well the character processes what they saw once they've noticed something. Key word there, I think, is once they've noticed, key phrase. Player intelligence versus character intelligence and all that. But in these computer games they have nowadays, everything is right there in front of them automatically. So they assume that if the GM doesn't mention something, it's not there, leaving the poor GM to decide whether to give the PC a check to make up for the player's lack of inquisitive, just to keep the game moving. Yeah, some really good points there. It's always been player intelligence versus character intelligence. It's always been a struggle, particularly with players that have opted to play fighters because of bad scores, or scores that only lead, high strength, high constitution, medium intelligence, or slightly on the low side. They were still a lot of fun. High dex. It stems back to when we used to roll in order in those what you took, and so you rolled 6 sets. Scrapped them or took it. It's fair to say that there's not enough stress on the interaction part of role-playing and of communicating. It's left for the playing groups to discover this on their own, or to have somebody who has played in one where there's a lot of information going back and forth, joining up with one who doesn't, who all of a sudden prompts the group to, oh, hey, she is doing well because they're getting a lot of information. Pardon me. I'm not completely opposed to such things as skill checks. I just feel that perhaps they're slightly too heavily relied upon nowadays in later editions. In regard to dragons, I read an article recently that took the Fafnir myth as the origin for dragons. So dragons are not natural creatures. They don't breed or have children. People become dragons when overcome with sin. I really like this idea, and I'm moving forward to making all monsters non-natural so they don't need to accommodate breeding populations, ranges, or any natural ecology. Okay. Your world. That'll be interesting. I'm personally not fond of the idea of evil people becoming dragons. Not just as a matter of course. Perhaps in some horrible, malevolent curse laid down by a god or a godling. But anyway, that's just my thing. And of course, I do have a slight fondness for dragons, as people may realize. Okay. Here's the verisimilitude theorizing why dragons have breath weapons. It's magic. And they reproduce missionary position mid-flight magically. By God, I don't know what those missionaries are preaching, but if I can fly, I'll sign up and you can dunk me tomorrow. Yeah, I always kind of thought that too, that even if they're not a normally aerial species, that for the purposes of mating they can grow wings. There are insects that have mating flights, and I've read several books over the years that posit this as a way of selecting the fittest male to breed with the female. Females are generally larger, and as is the case in many species. So, yeah, okay. No problems with me on that. Not to beat a dead boule, but the question begs to be asked. What was it like playing in a game where Gary had your PCs venture into Castle Greyhawk, arguably the most famous mega dungeon of all time? Were these sessions fun, and if so, how did Gary DMing such a big dungeon make it enjoyable for you and the other players? Also, I promise not to mention the MD word ever again. Well, the few opportunities that I had to play with Gary in Greyhawk, and they were very few, you didn't have a sense of a mega dungeon. It was a mega dungeon in that there were levels all over the place, not just stacked up straight. If you see the very crude original sketch in the front of one of the little brown books, they could be stacked at different levels, and just have long, thin connecting tunnels, or not even tunnels, but spider holes, type tiny things. And there was always, in my recollection, there was always a way into that part that you were going to adventure in that night. You didn't have to go through a bunch of others. Now, that part that you were going to adventure in may have had several levels, in which you knew you had to know that, okay, at this fork you go this way, and don't fool with the fountain, stuff like that. Now, what Gary had the knack for was absolutely, completely going Margaret Mead on you. Now, I've told the story before. We spent 3 nights adventuring when we were playtesting. Let's see, which one was it? Metamorphosis Alpha. Yeah, Metamorphosis Alpha, I think it was. And we were, I'm trying to remember, we did them both around the same times. Anyway, it's the one where they're in the big colony ship. And, that's Alpha. And it took us 2 or 3 nights to figure out that the neatly piled stacks of wood over in the corner was actually a staircase leading up to a door where all we saw was a thin line crack, because we were uneducated, ignorant, primitive peoples that were brave enough to explore other places than that area where they had been living previously. They were exploring other areas of the ship, various reasons how and why and whatever. But he wouldn't tell you anything at all because we wouldn't have known it. We didn't know what a staircase was. We didn't know what a flashlight was. One of us ended up not having a vision minus the rest of the game when we put it the wrong end up to our eye, trying to look down at, like a toilet paper roll. It didn't work. And what was fun with Gary is he had a twisted sense of humor. You didn't always appreciate it, but it was always there. And occasionally it was worthy of appreciation. Okay, this next one might take a little explanation. In regard to magical environments, do you arbitrarily assign low, normal, and high mana levels to your world maps such that PCs may be advantaged or the obverse by their choice of where to go, or do you use the level of mana deliberately in terms of story? Okay, and then there's a supplemental that says, do you have a worked out reason for different levels of mana, potency, mythos, or perhaps geological, or what have you. Okay, it's usually a story device. If I'm doing an outdoor part, like take Snake Riders of the Arredondo, a very big island that had to be basically completely explored by the end of the arc, I decided it would be fun as I was writing up in my mind, making up the backstory of this temple that had gone bad, and part of that was because there was a overabundance at one point of mana, is how I decided it, an overabundance, an affinity for magic, so in my head as I'm making up the backstory, some of which will be shared and some of it doesn't need to be, I like to come up with what happened here. Or there might be a lot of sad, evil magic into the side of an ancient battlefield. Now, where I got the idea of uneven magic is ley lines. Over the years, I've read several really interesting sci-fi / fantasy novels. There was a series, everybody traveled around inside of big cephalopods, and everything was organic. They shot seeds out of these little fish, and when you squeezed them, it was interesting. And that land had ley lines both for traveling along and for tapping into, as I recall. Or at least when they were broken, they leaked out, and therefore there was high magic and bad things happening and weird mutations and, sheep's wool turning green and those kinds of things. To say any one place where I picked up that idea is really, really difficult because there are so many stories and there's so many ways for magic to be dampened or tamped down a little bit. I just like it as a plot piece. Sometimes a surprise, usually a surprise, not often involving serious injury. Do I have a reason? Well, I guess, yeah, that's the reason. The leyland, my world had a cataclysm a long time ago when a bunch of magic users tried to do something that defied the laws of physics. So continents broke up and drifted, and there was a period of time when humans were almost wiped out, and various ages, and I wrote all this stuff years ago. And so as a result of that, various parts of the world of Makanda have fractured magic. Thank you for answering my questions. I feel that not enough questions are asked as well nowadays. It feels PCs are assumed to know more than they should. Yeah, if in one regard, I'm hardcore and nasty. If they don't ask the right questions or pick up on the right clues, then I don't have a whole lot of sympathy when bad things happen. If you just, blunderingly walk into a darkened room and find yourself enmeshed in spider webs, hey, you didn't look, you didn't ask, is there anything in the, hey, granted, that's an extreme example, I'll grant you. But I think the comparison holds. Ask questions. Your DM will let you know when you're asking too many or when they're silly, or the other players will. But you start asking, and they'll start asking, and when 3 or 4 people are asking, much more knowledge is acquired because everybody has a different question or slightly different nuance on the question. Okay, back in 2003, I bought a game called HeroScape. Several different types of figures, plastic heads, terrain to build, and he bought several add-ons. Yeah, I know. I went and looked at one, and I saw the latest one, I guess, was $300 on eBay. Simple, easy to read rules. Went out of production after a few years. Yeah, they do, don't they? And the kids and I play a pickup game of it. Figures you can be used for any system. Had fantasy and history, robots, orcs. Did I ever hear the game? Yeah, I did. I never played it. I watched it being played. I do that. I used to do that frequently when I went to more conventions. I would often lurk around in the board game hall or whatever and watch board games being played so I could learn to understand them that way without actually have to tediously sitting down and reading all the rules. It was a neat concept. The heavy mix master approach to lumping all those things together. But then again, in the early days of D&D, the guys set up in Lake Geneva were doing that with swords, Sturmgeschütz and sorcery, where they were having D&D adventurers time travel and run into a German half-track full of soldiers with a machine gun. Did you ever have a favorite combination of monsters to throw at your players? Any favorite traps as well? I'll answer the last one first. Nah, I don't use traps a lot. Having said that, there's usually, I don't go in for devious. I go in for the banal and the mundane because they're the most often overlooked. I designed a temple in Snake Riders that mimics the it mimics a snake. You have to crawl through its gut to get into the temple. And there's a series of stones that are actually spots on the tongue, as I recall, something like that, that you don't want to step on a couple of them. But hey, if you aren't checking for that kind of stuff, you deserve to step on a couple of them. Well, actually, you probably won't step on more than one of them. And so I don't. Yeah, they're traps, but they're also kind of brush up, and I don't always make them really lethal. But it's nice to have them around to get the get the players to get their tails back up, and on point. A rejoinder on clerics and sin. Yeah, I think your point is valid. That going into the deity of a cleric could open the way to buffing the character unreasonably. Yep. To be fair, that's what the Faustian bargain implies, yes. Though with dire consequences at the end, yes. But I take your point that it is a matter of game style, DM style. If the DM is interested in deities and making them part of the campaign logic, then it might play well for a cleric to face the angst of shifting allegiance. And all kinds of interesting options for plot lines could emerge, yeah. And a lot of those plot lines would be, if I was going to get into that part of it, I'd have quests and geas laid on to prove your worth, and then punishment geas is laid on for having deserted, and yeah, there'd be consequences. I definitely think the PC should doom themselves in the process, though, as in Faust losing his soul to hell after 4 and 20 years. Well, okay. Might make for a nice Michael Moorcock-style doomed characters. Could. It could. Interesting. If there was a strong, active campaign going that could support that kind of character redevelopment, that'd be interesting. Okay, this individual thought he asked it before, but if he didn't, here it is again anyway. How were the numbers for all the various saving throws arrived at? Was it just random, or was it whether a formula based off of percentages or something else? All right, the basic saving throws, I had nothing to do with the creation of. Those are all Gary and Dave. And yes, figuring out that we now had a die capable of generating 5% increments based on a 100% probability chart. A lot of it was, I think that's about right. And then we'll scale up and scale down. Odds. It's really what it was. Whatever odds Gary thought, what were the chances of, look at the saving throws for wands, staves, and spells and all that. If you're a low-level dude, you got very little chance in some of those cases. But as you get tougher and higher and more skilled and more learned, etc., your chances become much better until where maybe only be a 10% or less chance that something that would kill a second or third level won't even cause you to break out in a sweat. It's a sliding scale of what Gary and Dave worked out as probabilities. How does any game designer decide? Decide. That's the word I was looking for. A mechanic in his game or her game. You decide arbitrarily, I think it'll work best, and with this structure of a particular rule or this probability chart for a particular action, whatever. And through playtesting, you find out whether your ideas were any good. That's the regular process. You start with a guesstimate, and then you work it out. That's why really high-level clerics, nothing happens, nothing bothers them. They're like the guy in the Mighty Python movies that comes out of the cloud with the gas pump crown on his head. I can't honestly look into Gary's head and decide why he decided that petrify would, I think he thought, as any game designer would, okay, petrify, because you're going to base everything against the first level. That's how you start to build these type of skills or this type of chart. And so, all right, first level person, unskilled, fresh off the farm, one cast petrify. Well, it's pretty likely that it's going to happen. So you give it a high chance. You make a high saving throw. You got to roll this number or higher. It's pretty much arbitrary. That's pretty much what game designers do. They think out things like that as it affects the structure of their game. The formula is based on percentages. Now, Mike Carr, when he developed Fight in the Skies, which later became Dawn Patrol, had already worked out a method of generating percentages very accurately with 3 6-sided dice. But when polyhedrons came out, it was just so much easier. Okay, you mentioned in an early video you had a hand in segment-based combat. I prefer segment-based combat for the nuance it offers for very little additional crunch, contrary maybe to modern popular opinion. You also mentioned you primarily used theater of the mind in combat, especially at the time it was made. How much movement do you allow a PC to use per segment without obstacle? We primarily use mini grids, and as far as I can tell, this is not something that's consistent from game to game, which can actually have a profound difference. How do I run it? All right. This is how I run it. Because first and foremost, I have to have the theater in my mind. I have to see the newsreel. If the rest of them don't choose to pay attention, I can't help that, but I have to. I'm the projectionist, more or less. I use a 10, 1 to 10, or 0 to 9. Yeah, that's actually what I do, 0 to 9 initiative. And once combat is joined, everyone, monsters and player characters, or NPCs if they're involved, roll for initiative. Now, I'm parsing down a segment really small to measure, in some cases, who flinched faster. But that's when you get to do something, because my combat is like a stroboscope. Stop, 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 stop. And except in rare cases, I don't have the players square off against individual foes. In the theater, in the movie reel that I play, the stroboscopic action is literally a swirling melee. And so if the player characters are fighting three somethings, I'm blanking. I wanted to say trolls, that's a little tough. 3 hobgoblins. They don't get to say, I'm going to hit that one, I'm going to hit that one, I'm going to hit that one. When their turn comes, if they're choosing to swing and fight, they roll to hit, and I determine which one, by random, got hit. If the monsters choose to square off, that's a whole different game. Of course, then it is one-on-one, hack and hack until one falls. So the 1 to 10 also is, like I said earlier, a parsing of that very 6 seconds. I guess that's, 6 seconds. That's or 10 seconds. You can call it 10 and use a 1 to 9. Doesn't matter. It's just a method of who goes when. When, yes. Because sometimes you get similar numbers. Sometimes, supposing you have an archer who carries a bow, strung, but with not with an arrow nocked, simply holding it in their hand against the center part of the bow where the grip would be, or a couple of arrows. And boom, something happens. I'm going to shoot an arrow. Fine, what did you roll? I rolled a 3. Okay, you can shoot in 8. I'll give him the muscle memory to pull that arrow around and draw it in a fluid motion. Somebody wants to throw a spell, that's a whole different ball game unless they had already started to prepare it, or had done the preliminaries and were just waiting to set it off. Situational. That's why I use it that way. That's how I use it that way. It gives for a very fluid combat. Sometimes, somebody gets a great hit, lots of damage, and by bad luck, it hits the one that only took 2 to kill it anyway. And so it's dead. Or by the same token, good luck can hit that big meaty thunk into one who is now in serious trouble after having received that hit. It just makes for a lot more fun, in my opinion, swirling around. It's like a great big bar fight. Punch this guy, somebody backs into you, turn around and punch them. Somebody punches you. I've been in a couple of those. At the time, I thought they were fun. I had a different idea of fun back then. That's, I guess, that's how I run it. That's why I run it that way. I think it gives player characters. I really think it's a great deal in the player character's favor, because even though you might have rolled a 6 or 7, having everybody who rolled lower than you go and you saw what didn't work, you may have a better idea of what you want to try and do. Something to think about. Do I allow magic swords to have multiple attacks? No. Swords don't. Sword is a piece of metal. Might be enchanted. Might have a brain. Might be able to speak to you. Might be able to shoot ice cubes out the hilt and lightning bolts out the tip. But it's still a piece of metal. So, could it cause the wearer to be speeded up to where they would have? Certainly. Would a magic bow just make it seem like the arrows just leap to your fingers to knock them to the string? Okay. What would be a neat enchantment effect of a magic sword? It would always tell you if you were being lied to. it would be a lie detector on anybody within 10 feet. Wow. And of course, you don't have to let them know that you know they're lying, but it'll sure put you on your guard. I think that's the thing I'd want the most. Always know if you're being lied to. Is this true? Because lied to, I wouldn't be averse to defining lied to as deceived by illusion. So, yeah, sordid see-through illusions. Because they weren't what they were. They were a lie. Wouldn't that be great? Are monsters neither human nor animals? In the fantasy world, are there two categories of beings, natural animals and supernatural ones? Or is there more nuanced, interconnection between humans, elves, orcs, and owlbears? Oh, earlier on, there was a question about what my favorite monsters were. And when I run the Wheel of Blame, I love using owlbears, but always miniature ones, pygmies or dwarves. I like owlbears are just one of my favorite because they're so quintessential D&D. Especially when you figure they were the ones that came out of the plastic bag, or the bag of plastics. All right. Semantics here. In terms of D&D rules, monsters are everything that aren't player characters. NPCs sort of straddle the definitional line here if you take a strict reading of the rules. Now, if you're talking about monsters, okay. Anything that isn't a human or an elf or a dwarf or whatever you don't get scared by is a monster. Great chittering apes, 40 of them hanging in the trees over you, getting ready to throw coconuts because they're very antisocial. They're animals, but by definition in D&D, they're monsters because they are opposed to the party. Some monsters could be tamed or charmed. Go back to the wording here. Now, when we say monsters, we can go with the normal stuff out of mythology, pixies and fae, and werewolves and vampires. And all right, and now we're all pretty sure that those pretty well fall under the monster category. Though not all fae, because the elves are fae. So, I don't know, this is a it's really, I'm not trying to come down here as the authority on this. In terms in editorial terms, when the book rules are written, everything that isn't a player character or an NPC is a monster. Now, in cultural terms, what are monsters? Boogeymen under the bed, velociraptors chasing you down in your dreams, completely deranged and homicidal human beings slaughtering people for no reason. Great howling packs of hyenas with glistening, drippy teeth. Those are all monsters. Now, if you want to talk about mind flayers and stuff like that, I would have to think that, particularly in the case of the mind flayer, they're probably other dimensional, but are in our dimension. There's lots of monsters that can be attributed. All demons and devils and imps and all those can be attributed and, safely called a monster. If you want to get really into it, anything that you can't figure out how it procreates could be called a monster. Especially if it's like, it has to have something freakish happen to it to do that. Humans are humans, demi-humans, elves, dwarves, hobbits. Let's see, who else can I think of? Depending upon which format you apply, gnomes. Gnomes could be demi-humans. Pretty much notice a pattern here, bipedal. And everything else be a monster. Okay, but you could have evil gnomes. And then, by definition, in D&D, they become monsters. Yeah, I know. It's a circular argument, but I hope, natural animals that have been freaked out, by being exposed to weird concoctions or chemicals or whatever. A crocodile that grows to 26 feet and eats buffalo, well, I'd certainly call that an animal, but by God, I'd also call it a monster, particularly if it was, really had a bad disposition. Owlbears, bipedal, but humanoids are stretched. They're not very friendly. Probably a monster. Okay. Let's see. Where did I miss something? Okay. Oh, another question from the same person. Experience point deduction is a method of PC behavior correction, or are XP penalties or even level drain good ways to deal with overly murderous PCs? The temptations to behave sociopathically to deal with minor conundrums in RPGs is one of those perennial problems that other players have to deal with at least once in their play history, or that players have to. Monster humanoids can be seen as human. Monster humanoids can be seen as humans that it's okay to kill, like zombies, for example, whereas any inconvenient being is fair game for murder hobos. Yeah, alignment is there to help players study the suspension of disbelief, set boundaries on what is morally okay within fantasy, but these tools can only be used to limit the player's freedom to act. All right, how do you deal with sword-happy players who kill first? Well, I let them just go chop up something they've never seen before that growled at them, and then tell them, well, my God, that's a shame you put all those sword cuts and everything in there, because that pelt would have been worth 36,000 gold pieces to an alchemist. That'll get them to stop and think. Have them attack something that releases a bitter, foul, bad, possibly poisonous gas as soon as they puncture it. That'll slow them down. Give them a bunch of illusions. Illusions can be made to discourage that kind of charge behavior. And also, if you can spook them to running around, turn around and run it a couple of times, you might see a modification in their behavior. Well, first off, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that being a murder hobo is a whole lot of fun. I'm not going into the ethics or the moral or the religion or any of that. Just, people at the very when you boil it all down, what is D&D? What do? We kill things and take their stuff. Come on. It all boils down to that. I don't care if you spend 16 months going along, tracking down this deranged dude that you find is still alive in an ice castle somewhere, and you finally do it. What's the end of it? You kill him and you take his stuff. Along the way, things try to stop you. You kill them. You search the bodies. It's hand-to-mouth living. You aren't on a paycheck. You feed yourself, literally. Or find a fat job somewhere, sitting around the fire during the winter. Okay, nothing wrong with that. There's lots of ways. Ruining things is a great way to get them to slow down and stop. And in this case, yes, changing on the fly. If they're murderously, mindlessly, mindlessly dodging or lobbing flaming stuff into a room, and they succeed, they would find the ashy remnants of a little fortune worth of rare fabrics and tapestries, and what? Gone forever. Gone. And I would really lay it on thick about, I'd be making up famous tapestries and citing enormous auction house prices, and just, especially if you're in a campaign where gold is experience. Oh yeah, you just burned up 4 levels worth of gold. Now they can't go just cash it in right away. Finding something like that, they're going to have to, find buyers, etc. So it might take a year of campaign time to peddle all that stuff off. But with good agents, etc., who take a piece, the action, which is another way of cutting down the gold in the campaign. There's lots of good ways. Let them have all the gold their hearts desire, because you can always tax them back. Okay. How do you develop your villains in your games? I have 2 long-running campaigns, and in one, an Illithid is the lead villain who the group has chased and played against for over a year. He started out as a wizard in a short adventure with ideas of grandeur and became the Great Nemesis or whatever. I haven't run a campaign for ages. Back when I was writing adventures, the games I was running were test sessions. In that time here, given a set of pre-gens, or in other occasions drew up their own at a, come back next week with a bunch of 7th level, whatevers, and give me a good backstory justifying it, and you're good to go, and that's how we'd play. So when you're doing a modular adventure or a story arc, the monster becomes either an individual humanoid, a beast of some sort, an alien, schizophrenic, psychotic human being, and I fix what they are at the beginning, and then how they may or may not behave given circumstances as the adventure goes on. That's kind of that way. Any opinion or thoughts on Dungeon Crawl Classics DCC by Goodman Games or their original Adventures Reincarnated series? I am completely ignorant of the original Adventures Reincarnated series. Dungeon Crawl Classics, I think, is wonderful. I think it captures a lot of the spirit of, oh hell, let's go give it a try. I think they're funnel adventures in the hands of a good or even a great DM are just wonderful. How can you not enjoy a game with you go in with a stack of 15 or 20 first level characters all rolled up, dead, okay, next one. And whatever one you're playing, when you come out on the other end of the adventure, provided you do, well, now you got a level 1, and the levels are not all inflated. I mean, level 3 or level 4 in Dungeon Crawl Classics is yay, how the hell did you live that long? That's what that is. I think it's a wonderful game. Don't know anything about the others. All right, these I pulled off a Facebook thing that I missed last time because I said something on Facebook and some people jumped in. Hey Tim, when you edited the dragon, it was amazing. After you left, it stayed good for a while, but quickly went downhill. My question is, did it continue to keep up its quality because of content you left behind, or the editor that took over, or both? All right. One of the people that ultimately took over is now deceased. The other one is still alive. I can only surmise. I don't have a lot of inside information. I can surmise. Part of the reason that the Blooms bounced me out is because I had a rock-solid relationship with Gary. And when they didn't control all this, the majority of the stock, he kept telling them, leave him alone, I like what he's doing. When what happened, I got an ultimatum I chose not to accept. I had laid out, I think 33 was just coming out. We'd pretty much, to varying degrees, laid out up to 36, and we had articles earmarked out to 39. So that's really about 6 months after I left. Jake took over. Jake and I shared a lot of, editorial ideals, and I surmise that as the Blooms got rid of me, they started putting pressure on periodicals about, well, long story short, the magazine was a house organ well before it ended. Just D&D crap, just D&D crap, just D&D crap. And I loathe that fact. There's nothing wrong with a house organ. House organs promote their company's games. That's never what Dragon was. It wasn't even Dragon when I started. It was called The Dragon. And several people that wrote for me at Dragon followed me over to my new magazine, Adventure Gaming. They were some of the better people. Tramp did an article or two for me. Phineas, J.D. Webster moved Phineas Fingers over. Phil Neusler took Fantasy Smith with him. And there were some others. So, Dragon Magazine had no hold on them. So when I left, they were free to go. But I think eventually it became more and more, I won't say censored, but Jake left, and then Kim took over, and I think it was just an understanding, well, this kind of stuff can be published and nothing else. But I can't say that for sure. That's just my surmise. When Gary made the village of Hamlet, did he put it a lot of detail where the NPCs kept the money? Was that just how Gary wrote it? Or did he think PC thieves would try to steal money? Now, this was answered by another reader, or listener, or commenter. I've seen one theory is that because of the 1 gold piece equal 1 XP, it is important to know where all the treasure was. I know Gary often had multiple parties in the same areas as well, and one of them could definitely be evil-leaning, which would make this important as well in case they went all murdery. Gary expected thieves to thieve and fighters to fight, etc. And we, early on, in a lot of the modules, and Hamlet was one, there was a lot of detail there because we wanted people to think of their own detail. That makes sense? We wanted to say, yes, he hides his money, so that when they were advancing or, writing their own, expanding on it or whatever, perhaps they would think to do something similar. Otherwise, the DM, oh, where is the loot? Well, I don't know. It's in a box somewhere. Those are things the DM's got to think out all in advance anyway, for the most part. Okay, why are elves immune to ghoul paralysis? As I understand it, comes from chainmail. Several possibilities occur to me. Lord of the Rings suggests it might have been expanded to both elves and rangers if we're dealing with a fear aura. Perhaps neither if it was truly modeling the bone-chilling grasp of the Barrow Wight. 3 Hearts and 3 Lions presents elves in control of Nightgangers. And the shift from touch, meaning in melee, to a hit was part of the update and conversion to OD&D. Well, yeah, whenever you're a ghoul and we roll to hit, yeah, it's roll to touch. Hit being a touch. I'm aware of Gary's remarks about elves' positive energy being the rationale. Well, my understanding is that ghouls and ghasts and these things are pretty much product of men's imaginations. Our minds make things real. If somebody thinks hard enough about a god of slightly bent paper clips, one will be caused to exist somewhere. Ghouls, ghasts, those things weren't elven fears, nightmares. Now, vampires and werewolves might, because they're both supra-natural. Okay, not supra. If wights and ghasts and barrow wights and all that kind of stuff, their touch is almost always referred to as chilling and cold and freezing, and those are all human those are all human physical reactions. Physiognomy, yeah, that one. So I don't know. Are hobbits? I play it that if it's a human thought up bad thing, then that's who it affects. Why would a 700-year-old dwarf or a 700-year-old elf worry about something that could drain him a life level. Oh, I'm only going to be 1,100 and not 1,170. A whole lot less. I don't know that there's an absolute hard and fast why. It seems to be that in many stories, many myths, many fairy tales, which are often based in a folk myth long ago, elves are people of light. Elves are people of growing things and lush gardens and great fruit trees and all this kind of stuff. And they're kind of the antithesis, so ghouls have no effect, or gites or ghasts or any of those. I'm sure that with that rationale, I'm sure that there are monsters that only affect elves, because they caused them to be through their collective thoughts or fears or superstitions. There's one to think on. I don't know exactly why Gary said that exactly. It doesn't matter. I had another response to the rant I did last week about Games Workshop, and I don't like them. Haven't for years and years, but I don't single them out because a lot of British miniatures games boil down to skirmish games. Now, skirmish simply means small numbers. Since the days of the War Games Research Group, all British games have gotten smaller and smaller for smaller and smaller numbers of figures. Now, I understand that. That helps sell figures. If you only need 80 figures and you can have a lot of fun playing skirmish level games, well, then you're much more likely to buy 80 figures than if you need 210. So, okay, I understand that. But they all basically boil down to skirmish level games. Small numbers of units or troops or whatever. My dear friend who I've been speaking about is no worse, no better than this stricken class of gamer. So desperate to find a set of rules so that they could use these figures they loved and painted, that they'll play any old thing, even if it's a piece of shit. And he's pleading, oh, come on, I can teach you the rules in 2 hours. And I'm telling him, no, you could teach me your understanding of the rules in 2 hours, but I've already spent 2 hours on the rules, and I've got about a dozen questions. Here again we are, what came first, the game or the mini? Now, when a game is so great that they later come out with minis as, metal pieces or something, that's a whole different ballgame. When a game comes out that is so good that minis can be made for it, or better minis, or more apt or more accurate minis. But to put out a line of minis and then slap together some piece of crap set of rules is criminal. And I really don't know whether or not to condemn the buyers or not, because their brain goes, ew, 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 new minis to paint. Now, I'm a mini painter myself, though not to the numbers that some of my friends are, and we're all nuts. If we weren't nuts, why would we keep buying minis that we know we're never going to get ever painted, all of them, ever, and keep buying them? And so when we get amass a certain number of minis, then we look around for a set of rules. And when the only set's crap, we play with crap rules. Now, I do believe there's a set of rules in there, but it's going to take in my opinion, considerable adaptation and expansion to make a decent game. And again, the concept that you're not, this is just a holographic projection on a big screen so that you can see what it is down there that tiny point of light is. And that brings up another thing. Or maybe I glossed over it. In people asking questions, gamers asking questions. There's a couple of game format, electronic formats out there where the players see the entire map. Don't like that. And if that's what's causing the mindset not to ask, well, if it isn't there, if I don't see it, it isn't there. Well, that's wrong to begin with. Once you've been down there, once you go back the next time, sure, that's why we draw maps. That and to haul ass out of there if we're getting chased by something that could eat us. That's why we do it. Anyway, I wandered all over the two topics there. So, let's see, what is today? Today's that day. Okay, yeah, I'll be doing one more of these, and then I'm going to Texas. So I won't be doing the one the week I go to Texas, and then I'll do one the week I come back. So in the meantime, Dodata Govi.
Curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs. Still quite a feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar. Last man around when them rates went down. Calling Gary in that Lake Geneva town. Hey Gary, it's an awful mess. Let me edit, we'll have success. D&D and Dragon Magazine. He's a curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs, but he's still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar. Magic missile, it's a mortar shell. Make it hit in the first level spell. Brought psionics to the game to attack that wizard's brain. DSR and fantasy, collection of micro armory, tight with tramp under a tree, high as could be. He's the curmudgeon who wrote about the dungeons. Now he's the feller, live from the cellar. Talks about D&D and old school RPGs, but he's still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar. Still quite the feller, the curmudgeon in the cellar. Come on!